Hey young friends, Dr. Bill here. I'm so glad to be back with you, and I'm so glad that you joined me for today's lesson in the big names in the Bible. For the last several weeks we've been focusing on Jesus, and we've talked a lot about the things that Jesus did, how Jesus prayed, how he often got into disagreements and arguments with his adversaries, how Jesus taught, how he called friends to be with him. All of those are very, very important things. But today I want to call your attention to something else that Jesus did that was also very significant. Here it is. Jesus fed people. He provided food for large crowds of people. Now this fact was so important that there's a story of Jesus feeding the multitude in all four of our Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each of them tells us a story about Jesus feeding a multitude, and usually in a way out place, some place that was deserted, where there wasn't a food store or a village where a lot of food could be gotten quickly. So for today, we're going to focus on John's account of the story. Here's how it happened. Jesus was teaching the multitude on top of a mountain. A large crowd had gathered in because they were excited about the things that they had seen Jesus do. They were excited about the miracles he had performed. So they gathered and they heard him teach. At one point, one of Jesus' disciples, Philip, became aware of the size of the crowd and realized that they were in the middle of nowhere and likely there was not enough food to feed them. Philip even went so far as to tell Jesus, "Look, if we had 6 months' wages, we couldn't begin to feed this multitude." Well, Andrew, one of the other of Jesus' disciples, apparently he had been worried about this as well, and he had canvassed the crowd, the multitude, to see what they might have on hand. And John tells us that what they found was a little boy, a young person, who had 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he was willing to share that with the multitude. So Jesus took those loaves and fish, he blessed it, and then he began to break it apart so that it could be shared with others. And as a result, the whole multitude had more than enough to eat. And indeed, there were 12 baskets of leftovers. 12 full baskets of food left over from 5 loaves and 2 fish. Well, it's a wonderful story, and there's some important lessons that we can learn from this. First is this: Jesus was in the business of meeting the most basic human needs. Jesus cared about the fact that people often go hungry. And when they're hungry, he wanted to provide food. That tells us that Jesus wasn't interested only in what was inside a person. Jesus was also interested in the whole person. The fact that we get hungry, we get tired, that we need lots of different things to keep us alive. And so, on this occasion, when Jesus saw that the multitude was hungry and needed something to eat, he provided food for them to eat. Now, the important lesson here is that Jesus was interested in meeting basic needs that we have just to survive. That tells me that Jesus, well, he's not like Santa Claus. We don't present him with a list and say, "Here's what I want." No, Jesus has an eye for the things that we really, really need, not necessarily what we want. And so Jesus is interested in making sure people have enough to stay alive. That's why our church and other churches invest a lot of time and energy in feeding people, making sure there's enough to eat, making sure people have warm clothing, all kinds of things just like that. The second thing that's important in this story is that Jesus gave thanks. John stresses that Jesus said a blessing over the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. That tells me that Jesus, for one, was very grateful that someone was willing to share. And it also tells me that Jesus didn't take anything for granted. He saw the 5 loaves and the 2 fish as a gift from God. And as a result, he was very, very grateful. Now, we often express thanks for our food. We will say a blessing. But the story teaches us that we're to take nothing for granted, and that the attitude that we should have whenever good things come our way is an attitude of thanksgiving, of gratitude, of saying, you know, I didn't produce this by myself. Someone provided it for me. So Jesus was very, very grateful. And then the final lesson is that they had leftovers. 12 basketfuls of leftovers. Wow. All that from 5 loaves and 2 fish. That stresses that what God does in our lives, we often get more than we need. Sometimes when we ask God for things, sometimes when we're in need of something, well, when God answers, well, sometimes we get more than we bargained for on the good side. We get an extra helping of good things. The whole image here is to stress that God can provide way more than we need, especially when we find ourselves in hard places, in deserted places, where there's not a whole lot of stuff to go around. So here's the important lesson. Jesus cares about the whole person. He's interested not just in our hearts and our souls, but he's also interested in what it takes for us to live every single day. Well, that'll do it for today's lesson. I appreciate you joining me. I hope if you have any questions, you'll reach out to me however you're comfortable doing that. In the meantime, I wish you well. Pray God's blessings on you and your family. Take care. Bye-bye.